Hello and welcome to Watkins Wise Words, a podcast that celebrates conscious, passionate, wise and happy living. Thank you for tuning in, and here is your host.
So hello and welcome to this podcast interview. My name's Steve Nobel, and today I'm speaking with Kingsley Dennis, PhD, on his book, The Phoenix Generation, A New Era of Connection, Compassion and Consciousness. Now, Kingsley is a sociologist, researcher and author of a number of books, including Dawn of the Akashic Age, which he wrote in 2013 with Ervin Laszlo. He now lives in Andalusia, and in his own words, he continues to research, write, travel and grow veggies and keep on seeking to understand life's mysteries. And at the moment, he's returning to his first love of fiction, writing fiction, and has just finished his first children's book. Now, looking at this book, it really talks about humanity entering a momentous phase in its history. And there's a generation of children that would potentially radically reinvent human society, moving a culture from competition, control and censorship towards connection, communication and compassion. So Kingsley, welcome to you.
Thank you, Steve. It's good to connect with you.
So the world does seem to be in a kind of very crucial, as you say in your book, tipping point. There's a clash of paradigms going on. Can you say something about where we're at right at this moment?
Yeah, sure. I think really in these times, you really have to be living with your head under the sand not to notice that we are in a great kind of system transition. And if we talked about this subject even a decade ago, it would be hard for a majority of people to see that, because the status quo, the current systems were more or less seemingly operating okay, despite, a few ups and downs. But in the last few years especially, there's been so much disruption and breakdown in some of the major systems, and we can see that in the financial systems especially. We see it in a lot of cultural systems with social unrest. We see it in the educational systems, and also in the health systems as well, with a lot of outcry against the health industry. And so we've come to a point where I think most of us are now aware that the systems that we've been operating with for the last 200 years, more or less since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, are no longer adequate for where we need to go. And so the longer that we try to stay with these systems that are breaking down, the more obvious it will be, the more they'll break down, and the more that will be affected by them. So I think now we've come to a point where we can actually have this conversation, and majority of people can actually nod their heads and say, yes, I understand it. My own personal lives are being affected. So I think it's an opportune moment to actually talk about the transition at the moment, because not only is it visible, but it's affecting our personal lives. It's affecting the choices we make about where we wish to live, how we wish to live, our jobs, our family. And so it's come to a point where, because it's affecting us personally, it's going to have a greater impact upon the young children, as you mentioned. And that's why I started to approach this subject with the book, The Phoenix Generation, Steve.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, I mean, for a lot of people in the world at the moment, there's, as you mentioned, social unrest. There's also kind of war. I guess people are fighting against old systems. But really, in your book, you talk about, I think, something like, I think the term is renascence of replacement. So rather than fighting, it's really about creating new models to replace the old. Can you say something about that? Because for a lot of people, finding a new model is not a kind of an easy thing. It's easier, I guess, to just fight the old system and hope it breaks down and something new will emerge.
Indeed, it is. And generally, the first response is to fight the system. I think it's a human response to protest. And we saw that with the earlier waves. We saw it most famously with the Occupy Wall Street movement and their affiliated movements. And so to protest is similarly normal, but what it actually does is plays into the hands of the incumbent current systems, because then they can increase their laws to fight the resistance. And the visionary Buckminster Fuller famously said that you don't fight the existing system, you create new models that make the current system obsolete. And I think that's the way to go, is that we actually need now to focus on creating new models that will eventually replaced the incumbent systems without having to fight them. And so this is what I call almost the second wave of resistance. It's resistance of going out there and doing it yourselves to create the new models. And I think that's happening more and more, and people are getting it. They're waking up to this is the better way to do things, and especially the younger generation who, importantly, are more tech savvy, aware of how to use the growing networks of connection and communication, are then connecting amongst themselves and creating these models, which are actually having a lot more success. And they're what are being called disruptive innovation. And disruptive innovation is what comes from the periphery, not from the center. Because again, when you fight the center, you're fighting the old power base, and that really doesn't work. And so, if you have disruptive innovation that comes from the edges, from the periphery, that sometimes the center doesn't see it coming. Just as the Roman emperors didn't see the Visigoths coming from the periphery, they were too worried about their own senators. Then that's how real change happens, and it comes in and eventually starts to become too many anomalies for the system to cope with.
Yeah. Well, at once, you might have heard of this guy, but I once attended a talk by somebody called Charles Eisenstein, an American who wrote a book called Sacred Economics. And he's talking about the kind of reinvention of our kind of financial systems. But I did ask him during the talk whether he thought the current system could be completely reinvented or whether it would collapse. And his answer seemed to indicate to me that he thought that collapse was a distinct possibility. I mean, do you think that some of these old systems might collapse, will collapse, or have to collapse?
Well, I do. I follow. I'm aware of Einstein's work. We actually published him in our book, Dawn of the Akashic Age. And the question is, well, to what scale of collapse? There's partial collapse and there's total collapse. Now, I would disagree that total collapse is A, going to happen, or B, in our benefit. Because if you had total collapse of the financial systems, you would have complete anarchy. And you would have people rioting the streets because obviously when things get troublesome, such as a financial collapse, the first things you need are the basics like food. And so if, most people don't have the luxury or the capacity to grow their own food, they rely on the supermarkets. Now, if the financial systems collapse and they can't get, the supermarket no longer can get their stock coming in, and obviously the shelves will be bought out in the first couple of days, you will get anarchy. And no one wants that because it's not constructive. But we can have partial collapse, which I think we've already seen. We've had collapse in certain areas of the markets, in certain derivative markets, in the short-term futures selling, which really kind of all added to the collapse in September 2009. So partial collapse will send off warning signs that the system needs to be remodeled. And although we're not aware of it, there are people out there trying to remodel the system in various ways, in partial ways, and also bringing in again, disruptive partial economies, such as a digital economy. Bitcoin was one example. It's part of an economy called a blockchain. Now, Bitcoin was an early wave, an early contender. And obviously, it may not survive in the long term, but the Pandora's box is open now to digital economies. So they are coming out and being taken seriously. And then you have other more localized economies. I think we're now going to see the end eventually of the power and dominance of the dollar in the international markets because it's being contested by so many major international players. So we're seeing movement and change. We're seeing partial collapse, Steve, but I don't think that is in our interest to have a complete collapse.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. Two more questions before I go on to the kind of looking really more at the Phoenix generation. One is in terms of the political scene. At the moment we've got a lot of governments vying for power. But I think in your book you do talk about moving towards a planetary society, and yet there's conspiracy theorists' ideas around the new world, one world government, a new world order, and all that. What do you say about that kind of politically, where we'd probably be moving?
Beware the Borg. No, it's understandable that we are a very young society in terms of coming together. Because we've never had in our known history a planetary society. We've had great empires which tried to do that and tried to conquer as much terrain as possible. But it's not just a question of terrain. It's a question of attitude and consciousness of having to deal with that. So we're on the cusp now of a potential moving towards a planetary society. And that's made possible because of a few factors, mainly our technologies of connection and communication, and also because we're moving out of the age of empires. I don't feel that we're going to have any one major dominant power, such as America, which is the last empire, being able to to be the empire of the planet, because there's too many big players now in terms of resources. You've got the BRICS countries, you've got Brazil and Africa, South Africa, and you've got South American countries, Russia, China. There's too many big players to have an empire. And what's also coming up is the rise of the educated masses. And the word masses used to have a derogatory effect because they were manipulated, they were controlled to a large degree, or rather socially managed, to use that term. And that's why the fears of the Borg or the global conspiracy comes up. But we're moving towards a different era where technologies can actually individualize our capacities by coming together. Not coming together as a great manipulated mass like the Borg, but coming together with individual power and potential. And that's where politics is going to change. And the global powers have been aware of that for decades. In fact, in the early 70s, Zbigniew Brzezinski, the security advisor for the US government, actually wrote his book called The Tectonic Era, which sounds scary and was. And he basically predicted that, we are going to lose political power to the masses because when technology will empower them, they're going to have a greater participation. So we need to see technology as empowering participation through greater educated masses rather than see it as a fearful Borg factor, which in fact the government wants us to do. And we shouldn't play into that gameplay.
Okay, great. And the last question on this is, what about energy? Because it seems at the moment that energy is such a contentious factor, war in the Middle East over oil and superpowers vying over resources. But, there are these kind of new technologies really in use, solar, and I can't remember if it's fission or nuclear fission or fusion, the one nuclear energy at room temperature, and all these kind of new technologies like free energy technologies. Do you think this really bodes well for the planet, that there's on the horizon a great potential leap in new energy systems?
Oh, for sure. There's no denying that we are in the grip of great energy monopolies, which have been one of the major power drivers through the centuries, because you can't have power without the energy to fuel it. And in fact, the largest single body of fuel use is the US military. And because they're so widespread through the world and they need a huge fuel consumption, that they're in a kind of perpetual cyclic problem, in that they have to keep feeding themselves to keep their power maintained. But the issue is that we have the ability to move to some new technologies, but the stranglehold hasn't been let go of yet. But as we say, necessity is a mother invention, and one of the issues is distribution. Now, you have solar power. We have enough sun hitting the planet to fuel the whole planet. But how do you get that into a fair distributed system where people can benefit from that? So I think one of the things is that technologies is now creating a distributed power grid where people don't have to rely on a centralized grid so much. And also, some of the major players in the power industry, they know that the money in, money out returns, meaning that they have to put more money in to get the lower quality oil, which is deeper down with fracking and the tar sands. They have to spend more money purifying it, that when they get it to market, either they take less profits, or the price is out the range of people's ability to pay for it, which is no good because then they won't have a market. So by necessity, they're now investing in the new technologies because it's the only way they can keep their business afloat. So it's interesting. You have the change in technologies, the change in actual business thinking, but also, people are also doing DIY energy with localized energy and trying to, their own solar power cells and come up with some wonderfully inventive ideas in South Africa, for example. So with all these converging, I think it's going to also create a tipping point to new energies coming into the market. Not overnight, but in time.
Brilliant. So let's look at the Phoenix or bridging generation. What can you say something? What is this generation? What's their kind of? How would you describe them, and what's their core challenges?
Well, according to the Phoenix generation, Steve, because using the motif of the mythic bird rising from the ashes, Because not because we're also a part of the transition, all of us, every generation. I refer to ourselves as the bridge generation because we've experienced the old systems, the old world, and the new coming in. What's interesting is that generation coming in now will be the first generation to be born into a fully digitized world. A world where the internet is already fully set up, more or less, and also the smartphones, the appliances, and into a world which is shifting into the Internet of Things, into augmented environment. And so, I've had parents telling me that the children are so used to a kind of participating tactile environment, and they walk up to the television and try to touch it to move the television channel, like you do on a tablet, try to push it across. And so, and also, there seems to be what I point to, which really has no way to prove it or analyze it, but they're coming in with a greater instinctual knowledge. So what I sense is that our generations had to try to develop away from a lot of social conditioning, or what I call acquired information, whereby I see a lot of the younger children, they get things a lot quicker. We have to, we think, we have to explain it to them. And, you go through, well, this is that, and look at you and say, yeah, I know. So I think there's a greater instinctual knowledge already kind of coming up, and that is also going to allow them to see what needs to be done and automatically just understand different ways of doing things. And so the earlier wave of children, I think, had a kind of struggle. I know they got labelled in a lot of different labels, such as indigo children or etc., which wasn't always to their benefit. And so they had to struggle with a system, especially education, which didn't cater to them, and they couldn't fully fit in or understand. They were kind of in the middle. They were like the early wave of new generations. The next wave coming in, I think, the Phoenix ones, are going to be more fully aware and really, kind of fine-tuned or neurologically tuned to the world that's coming, rather than being half wired to the older world and half to the new. So in a sense, I think they are going to be rewired in a different way. Also because our world has a different energy signature. Now, this may sound esoteric, but we've changed the electromagnetic environment of our planet because of our technologies. Also, the planet, we go through different areas of the solar system. That's just natural. It's part of the spiral revolutions of our solar system. And so there's different energetic signatures upon the planets at various times. And so when you get a new generation coming in to let's say an energetic signature which is vastly different, both because of the shifts on the planet, because we're going into a digitized environment, plus we're now in a different, let's say, energetic environment within the cosmic solar system, then that is going to be changing how they react as well. So I think it's not one factor at all, it's a convergence of factors. And if we bear that in mind, I think we can see that there's a potential for a greater shift with this generation than we've seen through previous generations, Steve.
Yeah, I mean, I'm the grandfather of two young girls, and I look at them, and one's 5.5, one's 4.5, and they both got kind of iPads, and they flick through it as quickly as anything. And they seem to, as you say, instinctively know how to do these things and operate stuff, which is quite incredible. And I've had a couple of younger step children that, without any really studying, seem to pass their A levels without any real effort. So I kind of think that's quite amazing, really. But what advice would you give people like me, who are kind of in parental roles, to these younger kind of souls coming through with all this kind of different way of operating?
Well, my first response, Steve, is by looking at your photo on Skype, I can't believe that you have grandchildren already. You look so young.
Thank you. Yeah, I love you already.
But yeah, it's true. That's a question that I have received from people because, in fact, I wrote in the introduction to the book Phoenix Generation that actually the book isn't really for them. They may not be reading books at all. As you say, they'll be on the tablets or some other thing. And the book's for us because we're having to relate to them. And that gives a responsibility because we have two languages. We have the languages of the world as it has been until now, And we have the responsibility to try to learn the language of relating the new world to those who are coming in, the new generation. So that's why I call it the bridge generation. We have a foot on both sides of the river, so to speak. And I think our responsibility is perhaps to stand back and not try to teach them so much, but to learn from them. And to allow them to experiment, explore, and develop their own capabilities and capacities, which they will do, and to learn from them and to learn our responses from them rather than imposing anything on them, and to allow them freedom for that. So, in terms of education, we should look closely at of how we wish them to be educated, and look at if they go to a particular school, we should look at the curriculum and ask ourselves, is that what we wish them to learn in this way, and allow them to maybe learn also from a lot of open source information on the internet. There's a wonderful array of courses and self-learning, and so to allow them to receive as much impact as possible, and then to allow them to self-direct their learning and self-direct their growth, so we can protect them and be always around them rather than trying to be overbearing and protect them and to tell them our ways.
Great. Well, I know the bridging generation were kind of interested in older spiritual systems such as shamanism, and kind of really there when all these new metaphysical models of spirituality have been emerging. What do you think in terms of spirituality and consciousness? How will that affect the Phoenix generation?
Well, my sense is that they will, again, instinctively feel it all as one rather than having to categorize as being different. And which means that we are living in a more of a divisive duality or categorized way of perceiving the world. And so we fight over, is this science or is it spirituality, for example? And is it, is the objective understanding correct, or is the subjective through such as shamanic traditions and other wisdom traditions, are they more right? And so, we have this kind of duality which doesn't do us any good. And we are inherently a spiritual species, whether we call it that or not, because we do seek in our lives. We seek for answers, we seek for understanding, and sometimes we seek spiritual things through materialism because we don't wish to call ourselves spiritual. My sense is that this vocabulary will have less external meaning for the younger generation. They won't, for example, call themselves spiritual. They'll just call themselves, well, I am, and it will already be a part of their path. And so they won't necessarily also divide science and spirituality. They'll see it as a similar path of understanding the universe and the world around them. So I think we may see a drop-off of certain vocabulary that categorizes, and see the young generation just see it all as the same thing, but different aspects of the same thing.
Great. Now this is a very grand question, but I don't know if you can answer it in a couple of sentences. But what do you think the potential of this generation is? Where do you think it will lead the planet, in say 30 years' time? Have you got any idea whatsoever?
Well, in fact, I feel quite optimistic to say, I can't really answer that, which is a positive thing, because if we could answer it concretely, then it means that whatever we see in the future is within our vision. And I think it's contrary. I think that what's going to come, especially in the next 20, 30 years, because the young generation will be not only coming of age, but in the next 20, 30 years, they'll be entering the world and participating in basically they'll be the new generation to enter all the systems, even business systems, social systems. When people say to me, the big business will never change because it's always been that way. Well, my answer is, well, yes, because the old guard has always been the next ones to take over. But, that's changing now. When you get a young Phoenix generation person sitting in the seats of those businesses, they will be thinking differently before they've arrived, and they'll want to make change from within. And that's how real change occurs, not trying to fight from without, but changing from within. So I think there's going to be great changes in politics because of the nature of participatory politics and people wanting to have a greater say using technologies, there will be, I think, a great shift in the media, which we're already seeing already, because we're now in an age of access whereby people can access media production rather than just receiving the consumerist mainstream news. So we're going to see a lot of homegrown, self-produced, such as this podcast and all other podcasts. The media will be a lot more diverse and distributed and self-produced. So that's going to change the nature of the media industry. And a lot of the major brokers, such as the music industry and the news industry, who usually are the ones who control the flow, are going to see their power decrease as the flow goes to a more distributed level. Health industry, I think there's going to be a major change because there's already a backlash between the health industry is more or less the illness industry, and that's becoming more transparent that this pharmaceutical monopoly is not in our best interest. So there's going to be there's already a rise of what they're called biohacks or biopunks, about people who are researching their own information on biology and health and creating their own apps and open source biology and sharing it with people. So they're creating their own database of alternative therapies and understandings and that. So there's going to be a great change in the monopolies of the health industry. And I think there's going to be a great shift in the finances as well, because of different localized economies and digital economies by being used a lot more online by the younger generation. So these are just a few of them, Steve. And I think the main thing which is going to be the catalyst for all this change is a shift in human consciousness and perception. Because unless or until you see the world differently, you won't see the necessity for change. And we are struggling with that because we've been so conditioned by the systems through our lives that we're struggling to see the world differently. And that's our responsibility. That's our work. But the younger generation will more instinctively see, perceive, and consciously be aware of a different world. And that is going to be a major catalyst between all these great planetary systems going through an overhaul from within. Most of them as well.
Brilliant. Well, Kingsley, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed speaking with you. And the Phoenix Generation, which is published by Watkins Publishing and has a great quote on the front cover, which is the Phoenix Generation is a blueprint for tomorrow, a vision of renewed meaning, hope and optimism. That's Larry Dossey, MD, author of One Mind. So, Kingsley, all the best with this book. Lovely speaking with you.
Thanks, Steve. It's been great chatting. And I say, really, the conversation is endless. So we've only just touched the iceberg, but everyone can make themselves aware of this information and see the changing world. And so it's all in our hands. So I wish everyone well and, let us be part of the change.
Like what you've heard? Be part of our community by visiting watkinspublishing.com, following us on Twitter @WatkinsWisdom, or liking us on Facebook.